It is believed that on April 12, 1961, the first manned flight into space took place. This is the official version known to every schoolchild. But in fact, for 60 years now, in 2021, just a round date, disputes around this fact have not subsided. Was Yuri Gagarin really the first cosmonaut, or was he the first to manage to survive as a result of numerous experiments, or he was not in space at all, but was simply appointed to the role of the first cosmonaut by the Soviet government? The fact is that in this whole story there are a huge number of inconsistencies. And given that all possible archives regarding the Soviet space program are tightly closed, this not only gives rise to even more questions, but also causes a completely natural distrust of the official version of the first manned flight into space, evidence of which oddly enough let's figure it out. I think it's most logical to start with the recognition of a well-known fact: Soviet propaganda has never been reliable, advice always lied, and today it is given. Russia successfully continues this tradition, and this is an objective reality. Absolutely all Russian historiography from ancient times to the present day is riddled with lies on total lies, and the modern policy of Moscow continues to be built. And what can we say about the relatively recent times of intense rivalry in the field of space exploration between the USSR and the USA in the period from 1957 to 1988? The space race was a technological and ideological confrontation between countries. The Soviet Union spared neither effort nor money nor human lives in order to prove the superiority of the socialist system over the decaying West by all means. Which means that the most important part of the confrontation was propaganda. First, the satellite was launched solely for this purpose. The Soviets were so eager to be the first that they ignited in unsuccessful attempts to launch rocket after rocket until they finally got it on October 4, 1957. However, the PS-1 satellite contained nothing but batteries and a radio transmitter sending the same type of signal. There was no scientific equipment on it at all. Nevertheless, the propaganda noise and the shock in the world was very great for that, and counted in a month on November 3, 1957. The second satellite was launched, on which measuring and scientific equipment was already placed in a separate hermetic cabin, a dog Laika. It was a tragic flight to land artificial satellites of the Earth in the Union. Then they didn't know how and planned to euthanize the dog at the end of the experiment. However, Huskies stopped beating in the heart much earlier. Meanwhile, Soviet radio cheerfully reported several times a day about the well-being of an already dead animal. Here I immediately remember the tragedy of the Kursk submarine and Central Russian television for a whole week in the thick of the fact that submariners are alive. Moral values and the Moscow government are incompatible things, and it doesn't matter who we are talking about: dogs in space, drowned submariners, or Skov paratroopers lost near Donetsk. Unlike the Soviet Union, classified due to numerous accidents during launches to the United States, the launch of the first American astronaut into space was quite openly and calmly preparing for the flight of the first American astronaut into space. The launch of the Mercury Redstone 3 spacecraft was scheduled for May 2, 1961. A noisy advertising campaign was going on all over the country. American citizens enthusiastically awaited this event. The plans of the Americans were naturally followed. And in the Kremlin, Khrushchev tore and threw the order of the Secretary General's sword of Damocles hanging over Sergei Korolev was extremely simple: the very first man in space should only be Soviet. It was necessary to get ahead of NASA at any cost. What did it mean to make any sacrifices, including human ones, trying to inspire the whole world with the success of the USSR in conquering space? Soviet designers were forced to use unfinished raw rockets, which, due to the haste, often exploded, taking human lives. The first manned flight into space was to take place in December 1960 as it was prescribed by a secret decree of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers. But because of the large-scale catastrophe on the launch pads in the atom, Baikonur was then called so. The flight to the stars had to be postponed. Under the leadership of Mikhail Yangel, Soviet engineers were in a hurry to give a result by the November holiday that I would have been led to demonstrate the power of the socialist power. In addition, the famous Khrushchev Kuzkina mother in the direction of the West had to be refreshed by the launch of R-16, about which the United States would be well informed these states, but in reality, Kuzka's mother in one fell swoop covered the cosmodrome in an atom, claimed the lives of 126 people because of the rush, one of the rocket engines turned on ahead of time, burning everything within a radius of more than 100 meters. The temperature at the epicenter reached 3,000 degrees. What happened can only be compared with what was introduced in the film's catastrophes. It is useful to recall that October 1960 was generally not very successful for Soviet rocket science. The catastrophe in the atom was preceded by 2 more accidents and on a smaller scale. Therefore, what is called the first flight of Yuri Gagarin took place only on April 12, 1961. Although everything could have happened a few months earlier, but it was whether he was the first Italian agency Continental shortly after the announcement by the Soviet Union of Gagarin's flight to publish an interview with 2 radio amateurs. The brothers Yudik Kardia, who told that since 1957 they had recorded several tragedies in space, catching the radio signals of the dying pleas for help in Russian. Moans and intermittent heart rhythms on the made a lot of noise in the West from the citizens of the USSR. Of course, this was hidden on our Patreon. We published one of these radio intercept recordings with a detailed transcript of the text about Gagarin's flight. You can listen to the radio interception by clicking on the link in the hints in the description or in the first comment. November 10, 1959. The United States publishes a newspaper with sensational material. A secret recording of negotiations between the chief Soviet designer Sergei Korolev and an astronaut. Earth pressure is normal. After a minute of silence, I can't hear you. God, what to do, what I can't you understand, you understand. Then the speech of the cosmonaut turned into an indistinct muttering and disappeared completely. According to the journalist Alan Henderson, the cosmonaut died. His name was Alexander Belokinev. In April 1961, the Daily Power newspaper publishes an article by its Moscow correspondent Hiko on April 8. On board the spacecraft, Russia made an orbital flight. Vladimir Ilyushin, test pilot, son of the legendary aircraft designer. It is, by the way, that in the Guinness Book of Records 1964 will be indicated as the first cosmonaut of the planet. The Hungarian writer Eastwood Memorial wrote a whole book about the fact that the first cosmonaut was Viktor Ilyushin, who made 3 orbits around the Earth, but at the same time lost contact with ground services, as a result of which he had to switch to manual control. In the end, the astronaut made an emergency landing in China, where he was arrested by local authorities. He survived but was in an unsightly appearance after this unsuccessful landing with several fractures, bruises and abrasions. It was somehow undignified to present such a first Soviet cosmonaut to the world, and no one was in a hurry to return him to his homeland. Only a year later, Ilyushin was transferred to the Soviet Union under a secret agreement between the countries. When you study materials about the first manned flight into space, the most difficult thing is to step over Soviet propaganda clichés. But if you overcome this flow of propaganda, you come to the conclusion, but there is absolutely no evidence that Gagarin was in space. It's interesting, really. Remember the box office in whether you saw at least some footage, newsreels or photographs confirming Yuri Gagarin's flight into space. Those shots where Gagarin says his famous "let's go" were shot after the flight. That is, this film is not a documentary. But something like an artistic one is not a secret for a long time. Would be appropriate, captured, but strangely not even this is why there was no live broadcast of this significant event, because in the USA, for example, the flight of Alan Shepard on May 5, 1961 was broadcast to the whole world. It is also curious that a year before that in the Soviet Union, the flight of dogs, cosmonauts in a squirrel and an arrow, was completely removed. The camera was also inside the spacecraft, that is, video recording of the flight of animals was carried out by the first Soviet cosmonaut. No. It's strange, isn't it, generally in the USSR that it was customary to shoot on camera any even seemingly not very significant events, or even tragic ones, for example, the funeral of Lenin and Dzerzhinsky or a parade were filmed on camera on Red Square in 1941, and Stalin's speech before the parade was also filmed, and even with sound in the USSR they filmed a nuclear bomb test, and ballistic missile launches happened 6 months before Gagarin's flight and at the same cosmodrome, and look what happens. The catastrophe was filmed and Gagarin's flight was decided not to film. Such a significant event. Yes. It couldn't be that they should have filmed it without fail, and if they didn't film it, then explain it. To say this, maybe the film was the film went bad, the equipment failed, or something else prevented filming the world's first spaceflight of a Soviet person, and contradicting each other in different sources, reports, articles in newspapers and magazines. In the book of Gagarin himself, there is no single version of how the astronaut landed on the ground inside the descent vehicle or separately from it with a parachute at the first international conference on April 15, 1961. Gagarin, to everyone's surprise, instead of a story about his flight and what he saw in space, roared a formal speech, and according to eyewitnesses, the cosmonaut behaved very insecurely, terribly afraid to say something wrong, and kept looking back at academician Fedorov. Questions from foreign journalists rained down. Gagarin answered evasively at first, but then began to say strange things. When the influence began to disappear, gravity, I felt excellent. Weightlessness does not affect a person's working capacity. I ate the same way as earthly conditions. In weightlessness, my pulse and breathing were normal. I felt great. Thinking and working capacity were fully preserved. Then no one paid attention to these words. The fact is that people still did not know and did not understand the consequences and influence of weightlessness on the human body. Obviously did not know this, and Gagarin therefore, he said, frank nonsense of the problem of weightlessness, in fact, very serious. For example, the pulse drops to the level of 40. German Titov, the second Soviet cosmonaut, noted during the flight feelings of malaise, headache, nausea and even vomiting. And Gagarin allegedly not only did not feel anything, but also ate in weightlessness, and during on landing, he even sang his favorite song loudly. Motherland, here's Motherland knows. This is a quote from his book, Absolute Nonsense. The descent of the ship turns out to be even more unpleasant than the ascent. The ship begins to rotate around its axis, like on a carousel, almost 10 minutes. Pleasant enough, and it's clearly not up to songs. In general, in Gagarin's stories about his alleged flight, there are many mistakes. For example, he said that flying over the USSR he distinguished a campaign. This is completely impossible from a height of 200 kilometers, or the cosmonaut's phrase about that he saw South America and it is very beautiful. Actually, during the flight over South America there was the darkest night, and Gagarin could not see anything because when he was over Brazil it was 3 o'clock at night. It started at 2 o'clock. There was pitch black darkness. Gagarin removed at a press conference. Gagarin was also asked when the photos that he took in flight would be published. The answer stunned everyone on the spacecraft. There was no camera, so I didn't take any photos. Actually, it's difficult to comment. He himself in Baikonur for a century had a whole department of cinema and identikit which was led by Lieutenant Colonel Fokken. And as a result it turned out that the first picture of the Earth from space was taken by the second Soviet cosmonaut, German Titov, whose flight to the stars does not raise as many questions as the so-called flight of Yuri Gagarin. In general, I would like again to repeat Khrushchev's manic desire to overtake America at any cost. The ball of Damocles hung on specialists of the Soviet space program. In a hurry, many things could not be done properly. They mainly hoped for the well-known Russian avos in this regard. A typical example in the event of a fire at the start. The cosmonaut had to be ejected. What is called the Earth was with a deliberately super-reliable in quotation marks emergency rescue system in the spirit of the entire Campfire 3 of the Soviet space program of those years were equipped with an emergency rescue system. There were 4 hefty guys sitting in a shelter near the launch with a large nylon net in their hands in the event of an accident. They had to jump out to stretch into the net and catch the cosmonaut in it. Comments are unnecessary. At the start of Yuri Gagarin there were many problems, including communication interruptions and a non-closing hatch. It would be logical to postpone the launch until the final clarification of the causes of the problems and their complete elimination. But this was not allowed in the city. I was waiting for a report on the victory over the Americans in the space race. Useful, and they could not be eliminated so quickly in this case. Launching Vostok with Gagarin on board would be too risky, but not at all because of fears for the life of the cosmonaut, but because the task was to return him to Earth alive. It also turned out to be the most logical decision, but that space the ship Vostok flew into the Earth's orbit without Yuri Gagarin. Yes, yes, yes. That's exactly how it was, then simply dropped by parachute to the landing site of the descent vehicle. This version explains a lot, all inconsistencies and absurdities, as well as confidence in the obviously successful completion of the flight and the need to hide at first the fact of the astronaut's landing parachute. In October 1964, Khrushchev was relieved of all duties. In January 1966 died Korolev. Gagarin lost his patrons and turned out to be not very convenient in the new government. They say that at some banquet Yuri Gagarin said, "I still don't understand who I am, the first person or the last dog uttered past," as a joke. But as you know, in every joke there is a grain of truth. The explosion occurred on November 15, 1967. The Americans filming the film Soviets in Space were very surprised that A.C. Gagarin was flying in a training plane and climbed in with questions. Maybe for the first time in his life, Gagarin acted impolitely, silently parted the crowd with his hands, got into the car and left. On one of his foreign trips, Leonid Ilyich took Gagarin with him. Naturally, all attention was given to the first cosmonaut, Brezhnev. Then it was greatly offended. There is an assumption that communist officials were also embarrassed by Gagarin's drunkenness. For example, there is a known case in the Crimea when, being tipsy, he locked himself in a room with his sister, and after his wife knocked on the door, he jumped out of the balcony and smashed his face. Death. Gagarin is even more mysterious than his flight into space. There is a version that it became difficult to control the astronaut. He allowed himself to say too much and therefore they decided to remove him. But what was so superfluous, he could tell the truth that he did not fly anywhere. Gagarin's mother, Anna Timofeevna, for a long time after the death of Yuri. Said that her son was killed by the Brezhnev regime. In fact, the story of the first Soviet cosmonauts is in many ways revealing. This is an example of how the Moscow regime uses people and then gets rid of them with special cynicism. The motherland will leave you, son. This phrase by Arkady Babchenko is the best suited to this case. Yes, and not only to him. Yuri Gagarin, this a smiling and trusting guy from a simple peasant family, became a hostage to monstrous circumstances and an accomplice of the cosmic liars of the Soviet regime. It is impossible to interpret these events differently due to all of the above, however. This topic is not at all exhausted and it is still worth returning to because there are still more questions than answers. Thank you for your attention. Put likes, subscribe to the channel and press the bell.